Welcome to this special episode of Season 2 of Defence Talks Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by BAE Systems. We continue to explore the key questions shaping the defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK. And today we've got a special emergency podcast episode here ready for you to unpack the implications of the quickly developing conflict in the Middle East. Now, last week, tensions between US, Israel and Iran came to a head when the US and Israel launched joint strikes against Iran. The ripples are being felt far beyond the region, impacting European stability, UK national security, and of course our defence industrial priorities moving forward. I'm here today with my co-host, Paul Mason.
Well, Victoria, where to begin? We've plunged into a war of certainly global implications. We've got the Pentagon predicting potentially September as an end point, and yet 8 days ago, we're recording this, we should say, on Friday the 6th of March. 8 days ago, we didn't know about it. We knew it could happen. But what we've seen, just to summarise since then, obviously Iran is hitting out at not simply the Gulf states, we're now seeing the Southern Caucasus hit. We've seen Cyprus hit, and we don't know yet what the end state even looks like in the Pentagon's brain. So that's the kind of big picture. We'll be exploring in this episode, obviously with our two guests, the deep detail and trying to bring some geostrategic nous into a very rapidly moving situation. Absolutely,
and geopolitical and also geoeconomic implications, because of course, well, energy prices are soaring and there's so much more to unpack. So without any further delay, let's introduce our two wonderful guests today. So we've got Baroness Dr. Sophy Antrobus joining us here in the studio, and also Shashank Joshi, who's joining us online.
Baroness Dr. Sophy Antrobus, MBE, is co-director of the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London, where her research focuses on contemporary air power. So a whole lot of extra research is now going to have to be done, Sophie. Prior to this, she served with the Royal Air Force for 20 years, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a tour with the Royal Navy. In January 2026, Dr. Antrobus was made a Labour peer.
And we are delighted to have with us Shashank Joshi. And Shashank was the very first guest back in the day of Defence Talks 2.5 years ago now. So welcome back, Shashank. And he's the defence editor at The Economist, where he covers a wide range of security issues, including war, nuclear weapons and intelligence. He is also a visiting senior fellow at King's College London and has published books on Iran's nuclear programme and India's armed forces, among many other topics. So Shashank and Baroness Antrobus, welcome. And I guess, well, let's start maybe with a quick update on where things currently stand. What's the current situation and what key interests the UK is balancing in this conflict right now?
Well, I mean, clearly the UK is trying to tread that very careful line. It's got a duty to protect its own citizens, the British citizens both living in the Gulf states, but of course the British personnel on military bases, including in Bahrain and Cyprus. Then there's the duty to support our allies in the Gulf, and I'm aware that Gulf nations are very grateful for what we are trying to do to support them, and there is a lot of dialogue going on. I think my take on how the government, how Keir Starmer's approached this with the support of his cabinet is, how I would put it, is trying to keep his hand out of the mangle for as long as possible. It's impossible to keep it out completely, and once it's in, you can't really take it out. But I think that initial very cautious step, I am 100% in favour of. And now it's just day to day as things develop, as Paul's alluded to already. You know, it's really every day things are changing. So I think it's a terribly difficult balance to strike. And I just think we take it a day at a time. Shashank, I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah, I think first of all, we've seen European countries by and large stay away from this conflict, and the UK is in line with that European consensus. So we must avoid looking at these issues purely through the lens of the UK as though it is some aberration. It really is a common European position. But of course, there have been a range of emphases within those European standpoints. We've seen Pedro Sanchez in Spain, of course, be much more vocal about his opposition to the conflict. Now, in the UK, as we all know, any British Prime Minister of whatever political stripe has to contend with two things. And one of them is the huge domestic political unpopularity of Donald Trump and of this war in particular, a war that a very, very small minority of people support here, and indeed a minority of Americans, but also practical and legal reservations and internal cabinet disagreements. And we have reports that perhaps Ed Miliband and others were particularly opposed to the use of any UK facilities, even by America, even without UK participation. But against that, of course, Sir Keir Starmer also has to consider our ongoing, substantial and very important dependence on the United States, as well as the presence of an argument that has already been brewing over the status of the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia, a base which is directly now implicated in this conflict because of its availability to American B-2 bombers. So those are that's the balancing act any Prime Minister has to attempt. And I think the Prime Minister's broadly struck a reasonable balance on that, I think. When missiles have started flying, he said, yes, America can use British facilities like RAF Fairford and Diego Garcia for the purposes of suppressing Iranian missile launches. We all know, of course, it's very hard to directly isolate the purpose of a particular flight. So it may not be that this is only used for suppressing missile launches, but I would be very, very surprised if the UK or any other European country were to be further dragged into, Sophie, what you call the mangle, because, as you say, the political aims of this operation are profoundly hazy, and to the extent that we understand them to be regime change, I think very unappealing to this government.
So not getting drawn into the shooting war on an offensive basis is one thing, but the geoeconomic blowback brings us into it anyway. We are already in an energy security situation. The added complication of a Russian tanker blowing up off Libya for unexplained reasons, probably to do with, I would say, the Ukraine war, complicates things. I think it's worth reminding viewers and listeners that world wars, we tend retrospectively to see them as one thing. But for the United Kingdom, for example, the World War II was a series of wars. It wasn't, they didn't declare war on the Axis. They declared war on Germany and hoped against hope that they could keep Italy out of the war up until the day they joined. Italy joining completely changed the dynamics of World War II. So the reason I raise this is because what viewers and listeners might expect is that if Britain does get, and its European allies get dragged further in, I think it's likely that legal separations are made between what we are trying to do and what America claims it's trying to do. I don't know whether either of the discussants can respond to that.
I think you talking about the Second World War isn't at all inflammatory. I think it's really, really important that we do think very deeply and seriously about the fact that we're just seeing the world starting to light up in all those different places, and it's looking very, very, very dangerous.
I mean, I think it's worth just stepping back for 1 second and just stating this is a war that now spans the entire distance from Cyprus to Sri Lanka, and we have not seen a war on that scale or scope, I suppose you could say, since the American operations of the post 9/11 era. Ballistic missiles fired towards the territory of a NATO member state, which is an extraordinary development, and the first ever use of a torpedo by an American submarine to destroy a surface ship, an Iranian ship near Sri Lanka, 4,000 kilometers away from the core battle space. And of course, we've heard the Qatari Prime Minister say today that this is a war that could take down global economies. Yeah. I think that's somewhat exaggerated, but the energy shock that this is going to cause and is causing will have ramifications for India, for Europe, for China. All across the world.
I will be very keen to come back to geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences, and perhaps even the special relationship as well, or the bilateral relationship between the UK and the US. But Shashank, you've mentioned certain elements of this war that we've seen unfolding over the past couple of days. I guess it would be really interesting to try to unpack what are the first lessons to be learned and what are the potential implications for the UK defence industrial base when we think about, okay, well, what's next? Now we see this conflict unfolding in front of our eyes. We talk a lot about lessons from Ukraine since 2022 in particular. But given that we've been in this situation now for the past week or so, what are the first lessons emerging in your view?
Sure. Can I just start with three, and maybe more will come to me as I go on?
Sounds like a plan. Let's
yeah,
proceed.
I'm an Economist journalist, and I always think in threes.
Yeah.
So the first is good intelligence is absolutely vital to successful military operations. Whether you like the operation or not is you can put that aside. The ability to track, detect, identify Ayatollah Khamenei and destroy his compound in a meeting on the first salvo of this campaign, and then to continually have a target bank that's capable of striking all the senior political and military leadership of Iran, demonstrates a level of insight, visibility, and intelligence that is astonishing. It's exquisite intelligence. And the UK has incredible intelligence services. We know that from the things they've been able to discern. But the ability to have that exquisite battlefield intelligence and marrying it to precision weapons on that scale is really quite something. And I'm thinking here of the lesson we learned in provision of Storm Shadow to Ukraine, as with France, where we discovered that for the most complex, high-value, well-defended targets, it was American geospatial intelligence that we still relied upon for some of those targets. So there's a question here, I think, which is for the UK and for our European partners, which is how do we replicate that level of exquisite intelligence success into our adversaries, if that's the sort of effect and shock we hope to aim for? Number two, we in the UK in recent years, I think it's fair to say, have emphasized a vision of our military posture in Northern Europe that is centered on air and maritime capabilities, which is not to say our ground forces are irrelevant or that we haven't taken these quite seriously, but I think it's fair to say the direction of the integrated review and the direction of the strategic defense review and all of the capability investments have steadily prioritized air and maritime forces, and particularly our view that says, well, we wouldn't be providing the ground mass on the central front in NATO, but we would be providing vital action on the flanks, particularly with air and maritime. What I take from the Israeli and American air campaign is, would we be able to sustain the operational tempo of targeting in terms of munitions depth, magazine depth? And the Israelis have struck, as of, I think 2 days ago, they were striking about 1,000 targets a day. The Americans were striking about 500 a day. Now, of course, that helped by the fact they had air superiority. They weren't using standoff munitions. They could use stand-in munitions, laser-guided JDAMs and the like, and that gave them a bigger stockpile. But if we are saying air power is one of our critical contributions to NATO, over and above what the likes of Poland and Germany will provide, do we have the magazine depth to back up that claim? And then the final thing to say, which is the more obvious one we've all been tracking, is air defense. Air defense, I think the phrase that somebody used is table stakes in modern conflict. We've seen both at the low end with Shahed and Shahed variants and at the high end with ballistic missiles, the immense strain put upon Patriot, on THAAD, on all the other systems that sit below that, including Israeli Arrow and Iron Dome and others. We know perfectly well that the Gulf states have burned through years' worth of production of interceptors in this conflict so far. The consequences for Ukraine, supply to Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Asia, will be enormous. And so too for Europeans who have also been trying to stock up. And then what I'm also seeing at the counter-UAS level is the absolute vital importance of having low-cost interception systems that can take out a Shahed at considerably less than its $50,000 price tag. And right now, the Ukrainians are still far ahead of us.
Thank you.
I mean, Shashank's eaten most of my sandwiches there, but that's fine. I think just on the air defence, the final point, to kind of reinforce or expand on what he's just been talking about. I think what we see in this conflict, and it's the same as in Ukraine, is that real complexity of the high-low mix. of ballistic missiles coming in high and fast, and at the same time you've got low, slow drones to deal with as well. And that makes the air picture really complicated. And you've got mass, of course, with the drones. So that's something we know. We've seen Ukraine having to try and deal with this, but we've talked about it, but we haven't actually procured anything in the UK, or actually, I mean, we've got $1 billion committed in the SDR for air and missile defence, as well as cyber EM, but we've not seen that really where that's going or how that's going to be spent. I think, and to come to Shashank's point about the cost of doing this, you know, we can't use missiles worth £200,000. We've got to work out how we can do this with defences that cost a lot less, as Ukraine knows and is telling us quite rightly. And you know, we're deploying the Wildcat helicopter out there with the Martlet missile. That is there to deal with low and slow. But we're also, you know, deploying HMS Dragon. That's £1 billion destroyer that's supposed to be there to you know, defend the carrier groups. That's a very, very expensive way of defending against these kind of attacks. So I think I actually don't think they're new lessons. They're the same ones that Ukraine has learnt. We've sat by and watched it, but I just think now is the time. There's no more time to sort of say, oh well, we'll wait and see. Maybe the next war will be different. We can see a pattern here.
I mean, the frustration is that, for example, in the Royal Navy, there's a document, the Maritime Operating Concept, produced in 2022, which effectively came out and said, we are accepting a capability gap now in order that by 2030 we will produce a Navy that is hybrid, that is modern, that is system of systems. And it looked logical, whoever the conflict was going to be against. But when you hear the members of the public saying, you know, why are there so few ships? Why are there so few aircraft? The fact is that was a choice taken early in the decade. It was even identified by the Defence Select Committee as being a risk. And now a war has come along and bitten us in a place that we don't like, that dramatises all the risks we've taken, presumably.
It's no secret that we have a huge crisis of availability of vessels. And you know, I know the government response to this has been to say, well, you know, it's a team effort. The French had naval assets on the way there. The Greeks had a frigate that was on the way there, and I understand all of that. But this is of course, an RAF base on Cyprus. It's a British base. It's a British base that was struck by an Iranian drone. We need a little bit of nuance in this conversation, right? Which is that the capability that would be provided by a British destroyer would have been against really ballistic missile threats. You wouldn't really have wanted to use the capability on that ship against a Shahed drone. That would have been the wrong way to have done it. It wouldn't have been cost effective. They should have had other assets on Cyprus. And we're not the only country struggling with this. You know, the Shaheds fly low. We've seen that approach in Odessa, where they've flown low over the water and then tried to confound detection. And I think I understand all of that. What frustrates me, I just want to say, is that, you know, I've seen the British government again and again do some really impressive things in supporting Ukraine on solving precisely that problem. And indeed, I've seen them team up with the Ukrainians. We are building an Octopus FPV, a first-person view interceptor, in central England right now for this purpose, for you know, low-cost interception of Shahed-type one-way attack threats.
When we think about this unfolding conflict, what are the potential implications for the forces mix moving forward? Any initial thoughts on this?
I mean, maybe I'll come in and say sort of a little on the air side of things, in that, I mean, it's not so much about force mix. To Shashank's point about magazines, missiles, depth of stockpiles, that's a real issue. But the Typhoon force is at its max, right? And now we're sending some more Typhoons out to Qatar, 4 more, I believe. Something's going to have to give. They're going to have to stop exercise programs or other things, because if this tempo continues for weeks and weeks or months, and which is, you know, quite possible, then you know, the Typhoon force will be stretched to its limit. I think the other thing we've got to remember is, as we all know, logistics is the key often to winning wars. and I'm not sure that we've paid enough attention in the UK. So when we talk about force mix, we can talk about destroyers or typhoons, as I have just been talking, but we need to think about all the other things that come underneath it, including the people, because we're deploying people out there. We're going to have to rule them at some point if this goes on for months. You mentioned September, which from Trump. So I think force mix, we've got to be aware that goes beyond equipment and bits and pieces of kit to actually sustaining the people and the force.
And I think it's important we don't get mesmerised by the hard military power, because if this conflict metastasizes into a global conflict, and it's said that the Russians are providing targeting information already, that you have to constantly come back to the fact that modern wars are cognitive. And I think that when we're considering the potential ways in which this bifurcates, we should be just as much in that. When you were speaking, Shashank, about intelligence, obviously some of the intelligence that allowed the Israelis to hit the leadership compound is human intelligence based on years of SOE type penetration, which our own head of MI6, Blaise Metrovelli, was basically signalling that we need to move into that space. So it's not just a big warehouse full of missiles that we need. We probably need a whole rethink about the way intelligence and the military fit together.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing though, which is on your question about the force mix. What does this mean for our force mix? I think you've got to keep your eye on the ball. Strategy is not about rushing to adjust your force posture or mix in response to every crisis that arises. You learn the lessons from them, particularly the operational lessons. But strategy, there's a great phrase I always like by Frank Hoffman, who says strategy is an appetite suppressant. It's about choosing what you don't do as much as what you do. And we've seen, for example, in the SDR, there is a kind of a subtle readjustment of the way the UK thinks about activities outside the Euro-Atlantic. It's not an abandonment of those activities, but it sort of places certain conditions on them. It sort of adjusts aspirations a little bit. And I think we do have to ask, given everything we know about what I've said about the Navy side, what Sophie's just said about the pressure on the air side, is it, what force can the UK sustain in a Gulf crisis over a longer period? We should be planning now in the event this turns into a 6-month crisis, which it could do. The Americans have, are not known for always making the best strategic choices. They could be sucked into this against their will. If that's the case, and this is going on in 6 months, can we tie up a significant chunk of our air and naval assets batting away drones in the Middle East while Russia continues to rearm? I'm not sure that's the case. Russian rearmament and threats to Europe are still the first and most important threat the British Armed Forces have to face, and I think our strategy has to really be tailored to that, given the current resource envelope. And if the resources grow, that's fantastic. But we all know we shouldn't count on it.
Thank you, Shashank. Yes.
This, of course, raises a question that goes to the existential heart of NATO. As I understand it, the High North mission, the North Atlantic mission of the Carrier Strike Group 2026, is a NATO mission. And we are going as the lead nation of it. SACEUR now has to decide whether it's a good idea to send however many, 24, 36 F-35s up towards Svalbard while this is going on. And therefore the North Atlantic Council will be right now, presumably, discussing that. These are issues of strategy that I don't think have confronted a British government, because it's one thing to, and I have always said what the Tory government did was praiseworthy over Ukraine. Indeed, during HMS Defender 2021, it was praiseworthy. But we've not really ever confronted a two-front dilemma.
I mean, no, clearly, in a way, it's a totally different example, but we got ourselves into a right mess with Iraq and Afghanistan because we didn't say we could do those kind of medium-scale operations in two places at the same time for extended periods. So it's not a comparison, but it's a reminder that we don't have the capacity to do that kind of thing, and we potentially, arguably, got maybe more capability but less capacity or quantity.
Well, following on this, I guess some of the lessons from the past and in recent decades that sometimes we just drop the ball in other theaters. So when we think about the Euro-Atlantic and also when we think about the Indo-Pacific, what are the potential problems that we need to think about that are happening already simultaneously? And you've pointed out, Shashank, that of course, well, the primary threat is Russia and also the ongoing war in Ukraine, and that's the worry in Europe in particular. But what is happening also in the Indo-Pacific? What should we be thinking about?
I don't think we've got the capacity, UK-wise, frankly, to spend too much time. I mean, that sounds awful, and it's not a terribly educated or academic answer, but frankly, just keeping on top of support to Ukraine and this current conflict / crisis, I think in military terms, certainly, is probably all we can do. In other political terms and diplomatic terms, there's other things that can be done, but militarily, that's my answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. So a few thoughts on this. One is there's a defence-industrial connection. Obviously, we have, you're seeing, for example, Korean air defence systems being used in the Middle East. The supply of those interceptors could become vital when you have a situation of great stress placed on PAC-3 and THAAD interceptors, and you will need to have very adept diplomacy with countries like South Korea to make sure that you've got a sort of robust supply of those. Second of all, what's the diplomatic role for China here, particularly if Donald Trump decides he wants to step back, that actually he feels he shrinks from the precipice of total regime change and says, I want to do a deal. Given China's enormous dependence on energy from the Middle East, given its pre-existing relationship with Iran, what constructive role might it want to play, if any, in helping America achieve that aim? Although there's also, of course, the view that says China will be pleased to see America bogged down yet again in a long, protracted Middle Eastern conflict. So as allies who care about America's global position, what constructive points can we make to the United States on that? And then I think, finally, the last sort of thing to think about here is we see so many other countries ensnared in this. We've just had India granted permission by the United States to continue buying Russian oil in violation of the previous US restrictions in order to try to stabilize energy markets. So all of a sudden, you've got a country like India worried about what's happening with ships being torpedoed near its borders when they were coming back from an Indian fleet review, being allowed to buy Russian oil in a way that affects the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and seeing, of course, at the same time, a war breaking out between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the last 2 weeks. A war that, I think, in any normal times might have been on the front pages, but has been relegated to page 8, 9, 10. And all of these things are happening simultaneously. So I think it's not that we've got to plow in and say we must send a destroyer straight to this place or something like that. It's not about that. It's more about having the mental bandwidth, as Sophie put it, to sort of keep these things in view at the same time and understand how they connect to one another, to our advantage and also to our detriment.
The heartening thing is that the CRINC turns out to be an acronym for now.
China, Russia, Iran.
Yeah, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea turns out to be more of an acronym than an alliance. It's clear that Russia has not activated its mutual defense treaty or agreement with Iran. I think it's been reported that there was a request to do so. So they've said, no, sorry, they're probably providing targeting. China has shut down its oil exports for obvious reasons. It's probably got we know it's got a huge stockpile of oil, but it is hugely dependent on Iranian oil. And Iran is even more dependent on China buying its oil. So you could I'll just point out one other thing. North Korea has submarines and has a reckless attitude to geopolitics, full stop. So I think at the very least we're seeing a disorganization of the CRINC. But what's happening here, remember, we are constantly trying to manage our relationship with the global south. We are constantly trying to bring the BRIC countries back into the fold of at least neutrality towards the West. I'm not certain, I don't know whether either of you two know or have a hunch about how this will now play, whether global south countries like South Africa, Brazil will feel more inclined to gravitate to the Russia-China alliance or less.
Well, I think my feeling is that this is a cumulative effect on perceptions of US legitimacy in the world, and that follows on from the Maduro raid. It follows on from the Greenland crisis, and it follows on from the Trump administration's rhetoric around this conflict. And it feeds into a growing perception of America as a force that is unpredictable, as I think Mark Carney put it a few weeks ago, that is capricious. That is, you don't know where it will be, whether it will turn on you the next week. Certainly countries like India, I think, feel that. And the destruction of this Iranian submarine and the publication of the video appears to many countries to be gratuitous. Not necessarily wrong or illegal, but gratuitous in ways that causes discomfort with the nature of American power.
Everywhere from Somalia to Iran to Syria, Venezuela, Nigeria. You're absolutely right. Any country in the world is wondering if they're going to be one of the next. I think it's such a huge, profound change just in 14 months.
What I've heard, and I think it's confirmed by my own experience, is that this war has a far higher salience in the UK population's mind than the Ukraine one did, even when it was at its most kinetic and most manoeuvre kind of focused. People, in fact...
Why do you think that is?
Well, and even Trump's gambit on Greenland and the Maduro raid grabbed people's imagination, because I think people are starting to think in the UK this could happen. They don't think that I'm sure most of them don't think that Trump could in some way invade Britain, but they're now getting to see what happens to countries that can't defend themselves. People are starting to think bad things could happen to our country.
But I guess
who knows where that goes?
It's not necessarily related to the exact conflict as such. Maybe it's just the sequence and the sheer intensity of those conflicts. I think the very first big shock, at least in the 2020s, certainly was Ukraine in 2022 in February. And then since then, so much has happened. And when we think about 2026, we're only in March. And it's difficult actually to count everything that's happened in terms of really significant developments, conflicts on one hand.
Yeah. Yes.
So let's come back to the bilateral relationship and the special relationship between the UK and the US. So we know it's strained now. I mean, the rhetorics unfolding in recent days are not really comforting. Sophie, you've referred to this a bit earlier, but what's the mood now in Parliament when it comes to a bilateral relationship?
I should caveat, I've been in the House of Lords for 3 weeks, so speaking for the whole of Parliament at this stage is a bit too much of a responsibility. But I mean, I think there's real nervousness around where this is going to go and what the implications might be politically and economically. I'd say, and coming back to sort of my hat at Freeman and my work with the armed forces, on the military side, and I think, the intelligence services, I can't speak for them at the moment, but would say something similar. Daily work is still going on. Contact, and I actually know, the government, the Foreign Commonwealth, FCDO is in regular daily contact with the State Department, as they would be. So the sort of communications that are routine, military relationships, we've still got to exchange personnel out on American squadrons, air squadrons, and in the other services as well. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think there's a lot of let's do the business as usual. And then at the higher level, the more sort of rhetoric, the higher political level, there's real uncertainty.
Shashank, what's your journalistic view on this?
Yeah, I think that we're in a period in which broader political pressures have sort of subsumed the defence agenda. I think that, we've just had a very important by-election that has raised quite profound questions about the nature of our two-party system and the pressures on it, the rise of new parties who have very, very different views on defence spending, on Britain's place in the world, on its dealings with Russia, on its relationship to NATO, who are quite radical. I mean that in a neutral sense, in their view of these problems, and it means that there is no pressure from within on changing the fiscal envelope. As we know, defense spending in real terms will be pretty flat this year. It'll be it only really begins to rise in substantial ways in 2027, and then of course in the bulk of spending that is to come by 2035 comes in the 2030s. And we're doing all of this at a time when we're grappling with a series of other quite serious shocks around, the impact of AI and white-collar jobs and the workforce, on energy prices, with already sky-high energy prices being compounded by this crisis in the Gulf. So when I look at all of that and I ask, what is the prospect that we will see, for example, a coherent, well-thought-out defense investment plan in the near term, I feel incredibly pessimistic.
I mean, from a personal perspective, rather than wearing my political hat, I mean, this feels to me like the opportunity, and that's a horrible word to use in this sort of in a debate like this, but this is sort of Labour's chance/last chance to show that it really is a party that gets defence. Because I think it's been doing, the defence review was sensible. A lot of the decisions, the support that's ongoing in supporting Ukraine, the way that the Prime Minister navigated, the events of the last few days that we've just been discussing, it's got to back it up now with money, more, as Shashank just alluded to, than's being committed into the 2030s. My view is 3% by the end of the Parliament, and I think there is a stark choice. Commit properly, get that defence investment plan out there and funded, and show that, unlike the Greens, unlike Reform, Labour actually is committed. And this is, as I say, opportunity is a terrible word, but what is going on now, and you said, till 2026, we can hardly list everything that's going on. I think it is a moment. And I personally encourage, the Prime Minister to give that thought, but it's the Treasury at the end of the day.
They're trapped in a no-win situation where they've convinced themselves that there can't be a fiscal event outside the budget. So that one assumes that they are saying, okay, well, this is how we're going to get to 3%. This is how we're going to allocate the budget. What trade-offs we're going to make. I think they believe they can store them all up until the autumn budget. Spring statement itself, which they worked really hard to say, this is not a fiscal event, we're not taking any decisions, is out of date already because the projected inflation, projected growth will all be different. I don't think it's a hopeless situation, but I think that the thing that has to move is that the government, in its collective wisdom, needs to decide to do a fiscal event in response to this crisis. If it doesn't, it'll just be paralysed for 6 months.
Well, and I guess to conclude today's conversation, because I'm afraid we're out of time now, if it's not a wake-up call, I'm not sure what can be a wake-up call. So hopefully certain decisions will be made, and very, very soon. So Shashank and Baroness Antrobus, thank you so much for joining us today. Paul and I were delighted to have you here for this very special emergency episode. And of course, we will continue our conversations with you, and we thank our listeners for joining us as always. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.